ahead and start recording. Okay. All right. And everybody can hear?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so what we were going to do today was just briefly go through a few of the legal updates from OAPSA. They were discussed briefly at the OAPSA conference, but we wanted to take a little bit of time just to explore those a little bit more in depth. Obviously, we had intended to do this at the Special Education Forum, and then, you know, in light of the coronavirus, we had many more urgent updates to go over at that time. So we kind of moved it to the office hours. So we're going to just touch briefly on mental health and IDEA, chronic absenteeism and how that might impact child find in your district. And then we are going to give you a couple of the Federal Department of Education updates if you've not seen those around coronavirus, and then also let you know where you can find all current guidance and updates. Okay, Helen, do you want to talk about these first couple slides?
Yeah, I'm just basically going to read them and then we'll go through if there's any questions. The number of children and adolescents admitted to children's hospitals for thoughts of suicide or self-harm more than doubled during the last decade, according to new research presented at the 2017 Pediatric Academy Society's meeting in San Francisco. So at this point, what we were talking about is making sure that districts keep track of these students. Sometimes this comes through, like a counselor may know more, and they were talking about how a counselor may not reach out to possibly special ed, especially if the kid isn't on an IEP, and may not even alert somebody that the student's been out for a certain time or attempted suicide, and how the process goes about. So if there would be a case that maybe there should be a child fine, the student may have more reasons to possibly need a 504 or an IEP, not that we want to over-identify kids, just so that there's a process in place that everybody is aware that the student has either been out for a period of time and the fact that the self-harm and the suicide. Dee, do you have any?
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just, I mean, again, I think we all have seen this huge uptick in mental health issues in our schools, and this really just speaks to that. I mean, that's pretty incredible that it's more than doubled. So it really is probably the fastest growing area of need that schools are identifying, even in the preschool level, with so many students coming in with significant mental health issues, and obviously the need for our districts to be ready to meet those needs. And like Helen said, one of the critical things is making sure that everyone in the district, and that really is even beyond the guidance counselors, who may, by no fault of their own, just somehow find out that a student has been hospitalized, or a student is, you know, struggling, or again, thoughts of suicide or attempted, or any of those things, that they understand what their responsibility is. So that's kind of what we're going to talk through a little bit more.
Go ahead.
And Helen, if you want to, go ahead, you can talk about this one. This was one of the case studies that was shared at the OAPSA meeting.
Yes, and I'm sure Sherry can read this, but it was about the child that was hospitalized or in inpatient treatment for anxiety and depression, and no one initiated a meeting to discuss her diagnosis or a possible ETR, which I was talking about earlier, despite the district's knowledge that she was a child with a suspected disability. The fact that the inpatient treatment and the severe anxiety and depression possibly could have been seen as a student with emotional disturbance. Dee, add to that, if you would. like.
Yeah, that exactly. And this is a classic case of the district sort of failing to meet child find obligations because no one had requested an evaluation. That's one of the things that we want to dive into a little bit, is that it is not dependent, or it is not required that the parent initiate that request or make that referral. If the district has knowledge, then the district has that affirmative obligation. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. Under child find obligations, we all know this part, that districts have to identify, locate, and evaluate children who are disabled under both 504 and IDEA. One of the things that is sometimes missed is that affirmative obligation on the district. So it's not an excuse that the parent never asked for an evaluation, or that it was not brought to someone's direct attention. The case that Helen just shared, the fact that the office, that the attendance office knew that that child was out and was hospitalized, that in and of itself placed affirmative obligation on the district. So no one had to ask or bring it to anyone's attention that this student had anxiety and depression. The fact that the office knew that she was hospitalized for that was enough to place that affirmative obligation on the district. So what that means is, again, like Helen said at the beginning, that it's critical that staff within the district understand that when we have knowledge of those kinds of things for any student, whether they've already been on our radar or not, that in and of itself means that we need to take action and at least look at and consider whether or not the student should be suspected of having a disability. And certainly, if we're talking about an official diagnosis where a student was hospitalized with a diagnosis of depression and anxiety, then 100% yes, that in and of itself is going to be a suspicion of a disability. It may not mean that the student meets IDEA criteria and would need an IEP, but it certainly, I would think, would move us to consider 504. So again, under Child Find, we are obligated to seek out and identify students both under IDEA and also under 504. One of the things that Helen mentioned that is very important is that school counselors might be the first people in the district to know or suspect that there's a mental health issue. But as Helen said, they may not be aware of the obligation then of the district for that affirmative obligation under Child Find. And so it's really important that they do know that when they have that suspicion or when they have knowledge of a mental health issue, they need to let someone, generally is going to be the special education director or coordinator or someone in the district in the special education department, know about that so that the appropriate action can be taken at that point.
And also,
anything to add there, Helen?
Well, I was just going to say, and I know if the district is initiating something that, I mean, I'm sure they would tread lightly, because I'm sure there's going to be parents that would say, my kid is not going to be identified with emotional disturbance, and they don't necessarily have to be. I think it's just that we're stressing the obligation of the district to look at, especially when someone is long-term, hospitalized or whatnot. And like Dee Dee had said, it wouldn't have to necessarily be under IDEA. It could be a 504, and possibly parents don't even know that they could have some more assistance. But like I had said to Dee Dee when this came across, you're going to have to, there will be some parents that would be like, no, I mean, ED is the identifying disability most people don't want their kids labeled with, but sometimes I don't think they understand that it doesn't mean behavior. It could certainly mean depression, anxiety.
Well, that's exactly right. And like Helen said, they might not even meet that criteria. And it's important that when we have those initial conversations with families, that we say that we're not jumping to a suspicion of emotional disturbance. There are lots of students who are on 504s for generalized anxiety or depression or ADHD or things like that, that do not meet the qualifications for emotional disturbance. And so, to Helen's point, that's really important that we stress that we don't want families to assume that we're making the assumption that their child has an emotional disturbance and we're jumping to that. What we are simply saying is, knowing that there's a mental health issue means that we as the district need to do our due diligence and ensure that we are identifying the student if the student should qualify and need some additional support. And that's really the best way to approach it is, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support the student.
Okay.
Okay.
Any questions? Sherry, I'm sure you know most of this. You were at ABSA.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So again, these are some of the potential notices, things that should trigger for a district a consideration, or do we need to have a conversation about, is there a suspicion of disability? So again, we kind of already talked about short-term hospitalizations, or even like Helen said, even if it were a long-term, obviously, either of those should trigger that possibility of being a suspicion of disability. Knowing that a student is in crisis for any number of reasons. And I would pause there to say that sometimes, very often, we have students who are exposed to trauma and traumatic events. Those in and of themselves may not obviously qualify as a disability, but certainly should be on our radar for a reason that we may temporarily need to step in and provide some additional support. That also falls under our umbrella under special education when we know that a student is in crisis. And if you've, and as we know that you've been to other trainings with us and we've talked about that sometimes a student's behavior can radically change, but it's the result of a traumatic event in their life. And again, that still should obligate us to reach out and do some digging and determine if this is something that needs an evaluation, or if it's simply that we know that, Susie's father was just incarcerated, or there was a death in the family, and we need to come rally around her and pull together some additional support. So in any of those cases, the district would want to, again, sort of do due diligence in making sure that we investigate and determine how to best support that student, even if that does not result in a referral and an evaluation.
Well, and I'm just going to jump in here because depending upon, we certainly wouldn't be referring kids for IEPs, but I'm sure districts will be putting in place some kind of, I don't know, possibly trauma related, depending on how long we're out for coronavirus. I mean, hopefully parents are stressing, helping kids, especially young kids, deal with this. I know some of our teens probably feel they're pretty invincible and they don't need to be, they can be out doing whatever. But depending on how long this goes and what it looks like, it's probably a very scary time for adults and kids. And like I said, I would assume, depending on when we actually resume school, and at this point we have no idea except for the April 6th return date or the ending April 3rd. So I would think, there'll probably be some kind of transition back into school. I'm just thinking off at the top of my head when we're talking about, trauma. I'm sure some kids are going through trauma right now.
Very good point, Helen. And absolutely, I agree. And Helen and I kind of talked about that before, that we really do anticipate probably a little bit of a ramp up when school does resume in the number of cases where students have been exposed to trauma. It would not surprise me if we see more and more students struggling and some behaviors increasing, because again, it is a very scary experience. None of our students have ever encountered anything like this in their lifetimes. And the sad reality is that we are undoubtedly going to have some students coming back to school whenever that happens who have been personally impacted by the coronavirus situation, whether it's someone in their immediate family or someone that they know. So the likelihood of students returning to school having some kind of personal impact is probably pretty high. And Helen makes a good point that schools are going to need to consider that. Our districts will sort of need to be prepared for that and have some type of plan in place, just as they would when there's been a traumatic event at school, whether that was the untimely loss of a student through an accident or a school shooting. All of those things that schools put in place as part of their emergency operating plans when there's been some sort of community tragedy, I think would be appropriate for this time as well. Anything else on that, Helen?
No, I think that, you know, I just wanted to make that comment that, you know, we're going to probably see something when we return, and not necessarily anything for a suspected disability, but possibly a behavior change for some kids for being at home for so long too.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, a couple of other things that could serve as an indicator for that potential notice of suspected disability. Obviously, some of these are a given. If you receive communication from a private mental health provider, that one's pretty much a giveaway that, okay, there's something going on here. But then other things that may be more subtle and could go under the radar and go unnoticed are that marked decrease in attendance, a marked decline in grades or participation. Sometimes those are the things that go on for an extended period of time before the conversation really starts. And so that's one of the areas we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment or two that we really do need to attend to. Obviously, a records request from a private school or parent, don't just assume that the parent is leaving, for whatever, a myriad of reasons, but that should, again, trigger our response to at least do some investigating and find out if it's because the parent suspects a disability or there's concern about needs that the parent thinks the district isn't meeting or isn't equipped to meet. Notification that a private evaluation is being sought. Obviously, if a parent's gone to that length, then the parent certainly suspects something and is concerned. And so that would also, spur us into action. And then finally, if you're having some type of meeting, obviously not even at the referral or evaluation point yet, but just talking about a student's needs in terms of mental health, and you've got an attorney or an advocate attending, again, that's probably a good indicator that that there is a suspicion on the parent's part and that, they're going to be moving forward. So any of those might serve as that suspicion of disability. Okay, so we're going to talk over just a couple of do's and don'ts. Do ask parents for more information. And one of the things Helen mentioned earlier about being sensitive to the fact that, particularly when we're dealing with mental health issues, there is a stigma attached to that still for many people. And so parents may feel very defensive and are, not necessarily going to come volunteering information for fear that their child will be labeled, or as Helen had mentioned before, for fear that we would immediately be moving to, an emotional disturbance, which is not necessarily the case, but that's a very unsettling feeling for parents. So as the district, you may need to reassure parents that you're there to support and help their child, and ask for more information. And again, from that approach that we're not here to label, we're not here to stigmatize, we simply want to provide whatever, Susie needs at this point in time. If you know that a student was hospitalized, it is appropriate to ask for that discharge summary again, so that the district can see what the recommendations were, what the guidelines were, what the restrictions were, so that you can assure that you are putting those kinds of things in place. Obviously, when there's a suspicion, you need to move to the evaluation process. Do get a release of information, particularly if a student has been hospitalized or is receiving outside treatment. That information is going to be critical in a district, moving forward with an evaluation. And then obviously, if the student qualifies, with putting services in place that are appropriate. So that release of information becomes really important. Again, you do want to convene the RTI, the MTSS team. Obviously, whether or not a student has been receiving interventions, that may be the time that those interventions need to start if they've not already. Consider supports from the district, consider an evaluation, obviously documenting all decisions that are made, using a PRO1, and then following up with the student and the parents just to monitor the situation, because things can also change. You may have a situation where a student doesn't necessarily you wouldn't necessarily have that suspicion of disability. You, again, think that it's sort of a temporary situation for a student, thinking about in terms of they've been through a traumatic experience. So the district provides RTI, MTSS, some interventions and support, and chooses not to move forward with an evaluation. But again, it's important to follow up and monitor that situation, because at any point in time, things could change enough that it does become warranted to proceed with an evaluation. So, at any point in time that could happen. So it's important to kind of follow up and again, keep tabs on the student and the situation. Okay, Helen, do you want to talk through the don'ts?
Yes. Don't handle the situation alone. Like Dee Dee was saying, you would involve the people that either if you did receive something from mental health, or, it's a counselor, and just involve the people that need to be involved. And once again, assume a child's decreased attendance or performance is not due to laziness. I think this sometimes happens in high schools, more so than the younger grades, where, if a student just checks out, there are times, not always, that, it's kind of easy to say, this kid just doesn't want to participate. Sometimes they don't, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's due to being lazy. We need to dig a little deeper. Inform the parents that the district will not provide assistance since they have private services. Okay. I would say that just means if this district, or if the parents are getting private services, then, not necessarily is the district going to have any responsibility. I think some of that would come into bigger discussion if the parents were asking for the district for resources to help their child, or you would be telling the parents you have some resources to help the student. And right away, assume an alternate learning environment will fix the problem. I think that's more like when we do see some of the behaviors that come out that, and I don't think this is with necessarily happening as much anymore, but it's like, okay, teacher wants the kid out of the class. And I having been a teacher, you know, I'm not putting teachers down at all, but on occasion, there are times when it's like, okay, the student is just, you know, out of control. Let's get an alternative placement. So Dee Dee, you can jump
Yeah.
in anywhere, and I'm sure Sherry probably knows this fairly well herself.
Yeah, the only two things that I would reiterate, the two bullets that Helen talked about, not saying to parents that just because you have private services, we're not going to provide any assistance. That's a no-no. We cannot do that. And that unfortunately does sometimes happen, where a district assumes that because a student is receiving private services, whether those, you know, are for mental health or for whatever, that sort of lets them off the hook. And that is certainly not the case. Just because a student may be receiving therapy or counseling, psychiatric services, whatever it is, does not mean that the student is not still entitled to some support and assistance from the district.
Yeah, thanks
and
for
then
saying that, Dee Dee, because I think I made it sound like you wouldn't have to provide services, which we know is not true. So yeah, definitely you would, you know, still want to provide assistance, even if students are getting private services. Doesn't mean
exactly.
Some parents wouldn't want it, but yes, we still have that. We still have to provide, as a district, offer services or assistance.
Right. We still have that obligation. And then again, like Helen said, you know, we can't tell parents, you know, I think everyone knows this, but unfortunately it does still happen. The last thing we ever want to do is say to a parent, we don't have the resources to help your child, or we don't offer that here. That's not an excuse. As we all know, under the law, we are obligated to provide whatever the team determines a student needs, or we're on the hook for covering the cost where that service could be provided. So we never want to make the mistake of saying that, you know, the district doesn't have the resources, or we don't do that here. And it may sound surprising, but we do actually still hear that sometimes, where districts sometimes just in frustration sort of blurt that out, and that is the last thing that we ever want to say. So again, just those two are pretty critical. And then actually Helen mentioned, and we're going to talk about that right now, chronic absenteeism. And this is one that we didn't go into in depth at OAPSA, but we really felt that it was pertinent to this discussion and to talk about it a little bit more, because we all know that this is something that has been dramatically on the rise in the last few years, is chronic absenteeism. And we think of chronic absenteeism primarily with our high school students, and certainly it is an issue there, but more and more we are seeing chronic absenteeism at the elementary and even at the preschool level. And so it is not addressed in House Bill 410. The bill does not specifically call out chronic absenteeism triggering a suspicion of a disability. However, we go back to that affirmative obligation that we talked about at the beginning of the hour, that just because a referral or a request is not made by a family does not mean that the district doesn't have obligation when they have knowledge of something. Well, we absolutely have knowledge of students not coming to school. And so when there is a student with chronic absenteeism, the district absolutely should consider whether or not there's a suspicion of a disability. And I would say that that is true for any age level, any grade level. Again, we think of chronic absenteeism because we think of teenagers, well, they don't want to come to school, but there could be some underlying cause. And certainly if particularly, and I know Helen talks about this often, about High school students don't want to be labeled, don't want to be seen as different, and if they are struggling academically, don't want that to be called out. It's easier just to not come to school. So certainly we could see that at the high school level, but again, as we see more and more situations with chronic absenteeism in early elementary grades, we definitely should be considering, is that a suspicion of disability? Kids don't just not come to school for no reason at all. There's some reason why they're not attending. And again, it could even be because of trauma. And so maybe it isn't a disability that we suspect, but regardless, there may be a need for some additional support and intervention on the part of the district. So that's one thing that the chronic absenteeism is one area that we specifically wanted to talk about, because we have seen in our region, this is an issue, and it is not always on the radar of special educators. It doesn't always rise to the level of teams considering whether or not this is a suspicion of a disability. And so often those conversations are not taking place. And just as we said before about staff in the district being aware of their obligation when they know that a student's been hospitalized or things of that nature, knowing what that process should be, the same is true for attendance officers and our EMIS coordinators and people who would have that first knowledge of a student having chronic absenteeism. And we know that districts have absence intervention teams, but again, it's not specifically called out in the House Bill 410 that they would move in that direction. Theirs is more, again, they have steps that they follow to try to get the student in school, reporting truancy, making referrals to the court system. All of that is a part of the absence intervention team, but they don't necessarily have that missing piece of informing someone that there could be a suspicion of a disability. And the reason we wanted to call that out is because it could be a potential child fine violation if a district has that knowledge and fails to meet that affirmative obligation. And that's why we wanted to specifically call that out today. Okay, Helen, anything you wanted to add there?
No.
Okay. And obviously, we all know this. At that point, we would consider, does the student qualify if we're moving to an evaluation? Do we suspect that the student would need specially designed instruction and we want to do an evaluation through the ETR process? Or do we think simply that, again, if it's a mental health issue or something that we think could be serviced under a 504, then the district can just evaluate for a 504. And you do not always have to do a full ETR. It is also okay to start with an evaluation for a 504 if that's where the suspicion leads. Okay, last thing, we just wanted to give you a couple of updates where we're at right now in relation to COVID-19. So yesterday morning, the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, did put out a fact sheet. I just put, and our SST also blasted this out through our newsletter update. So hopefully everyone received that yesterday. But sort of the crux of it was they did in fact give sort of a waiver, if you will, to districts who have, IEPs and ETRs during this time where we are closed, and basically said that those meetings do not have to take place, that they would be delayed until schools reopened, obviously because it's not possible. And this, I pasted this on here just so you could see, they did use language that said, If it doesn't require a face-to-face assessment or an observation, you can move forward and hold those meetings as long as the parent or the guardian consents. You do not have to, but the district can as long as the family agrees. The family may prefer not to do it remotely, and the family may prefer to wait. And what this is saying is that's okay, that those things can be delayed until school resumes. And the same applies to the 504. So the one thing that I do want to stress that is in the webinar as well as the fact sheet is in the webinar, they did say under civil rights that if a district is providing services to the general population of students through distance learning or some type of electronic learning, then it is the responsibility of the district to determine if there are access issues for students with disabilities. And they specifically called out in the webinar that we are sort of moving into a new era of electronic learning due to the coronavirus, and that, you know, it is critical that districts ensure that students with disabilities can access their learning in that way. They talked about evaluating whether or not a student can use a mouse, whether or not the student can engage in learning on the computer, because if not, then it could potentially be a civil rights violation or a violation of FAPE if those considerations haven't been discussed and there's not some form of or some plan of how best to serve the student. That's not going to be in every case. Many of our students with disabilities, you know, with accommodations and things built in and shared with the families, would be able to access learning electronically, but certainly not everyone. So those were sort of the two big takeaways from that. And finally, Helen and I just wanted to share with you the links where you can see some of that information. This first link is the considerations put out by CASE. And again, that's that Council for Administrators of Special Education, sort of the national OAPSA, if you will. And this is the updated one that came out yesterday. And then the second link is to ODE's COVID-19 updates. And that's a link to the page, and there are several links within there for their FAQ sheet, their guidance, and so forth. And then finally, that bottom link is that webinar that I just referenced that came out yesterday morning from the Department of Federal Education, yeah, and the Civil Rights Office specifically. And they did indicate that there will be 2 more webinars coming, one on March 27th and the second, I believe it was going to be on April 4th. But certainly if you visit that site, the information is there on the next webinars that will be taking place. And Helen and I are monitoring all of those updates as they come in, as is our entire office. And we certainly, as things come up like this yesterday, was pretty big news for everyone. And so again, Janine immediately blasted it out on our newsletter. So we will do everything we can to keep everyone informed and updated.
And Janine will continue to blast it out on the special ed directors email blast too, not just through the the communication webinar or the
newsletters.
The newsletters, yes, sorry, I'm having brain drain. But anyhow, yeah, Janine will continue to do that. And Janine's constantly sending us any updates like she will be doing to the state. And if there's a little controversy, there's a couple things I know. When I was on a Zoom with her yesterday with our career tech ed person, she had asked me about something that had come out and not necessarily did she agree with, but, or no for sure, and she had contacted ODE and was waiting for a response. So There definitely, as this continues, definitely will be some more updates, and she's on top of that. So, and informing us, and like I said, we'll be informing directors with whatever she is told.